Eleonora Patacchini graduated in statistics from the University of Rome in 1997. She studied economics at the University Pompeu Fabra and at the University of Southampton in England, where she received her PhD in 2004. Since 2001, she has been a researcher in economics and statistics at the University of Rome. Graduates of leading Italian universities have great difficulty in finding such research faculty positions in their home institutions, and many of them end up in universities in other countries, so her return to the University of Rome marks her as one of the leading young scholars of her generation. This article, published in 2009, is important because it points out a number of differences in the process of urban deconcentration between U.S. and European cities. In particular, note how she and her colleagues describe and explain different locations for segregated ethnic minorities in cities on these two continents.
Patacchini and her colleagues read some of the same research that you have studied, investigating patterns of urban sprawl in the United States. As social scientists, they were curious to know whether the same kind of explanatory models that predict variations in sprawl for different U.S. cities could also be applied to other parts of the world, particularly in this case to European countries. But as almost always happens whenever you want to look into this kind of comparative international research, she and her colleagues immediately ran into the familiar problem of different systems of measurement. The definition of cities themselves varies from country to country. Most European countries concentrate on official administrative boundaries that divide up their territory into geographic subunits. The most urban places are the largest cities with the highest level administrative offices, as described by central place theory considered earlier. This administrative central place theory has become a self-fulfilling prophecy about urban forms, as European governments have applied it to their administrative and political policies. Could this difference in definitions be a problem for comparative research? Patacchini does not really think so, but she is careful to explore the issue in case you or other readers may disagree. Was trained as an economist, she relies on economic theories about market demand for land as a way of understanding what could be driving urban sprawl. Economists start from the idea that market competition forces producers to seek the most efficient, profitable locations for their businesses. The more efficient and profitable the location, the more a producer will be willing to spend to get the land to put a business there. And efficiency in this case is usually translated by the economists into proximity. If buyers and sellers can be close to each other, they have less trouble making their deals, less trouble moving goods back and forth, less trouble getting to clients in order to provide services to them, and so on. The assumption that proximity is efficient gives us a valuable insight into why a city would have a central business district at its core, where the value of each parcel of land is higher than anywhere else. What Patacchini and her colleagues called a monocentric model. Since this central location is the best place to minimize your distance from all your other business partners, that is where everybody will try to set up shop. Economists describe this in terms of demand curves, showing the amount of rent that someone is willing to pay for land as a function of distance from the central business district of the city. The figure here shows that office-based service providers are the most sensitive to this need to be close to other firms. The demand curve for them reaches higher on the left at the very center of the city than for any other type of land use. That is why you find office skyscrapers downtown. In the competition for space, these businesses are willing to pay more than anybody else to be in the middle of everything. But their demand curve also falls off with distance from the core faster than any other group. This makes sense because if they value proximity so highly, increasing distances will make them lose their interest in a particular place faster than for any other group. Demand curve for manufacturing firms in this figure starts off lower than for the service providers and their office buildings. Manufacturing requires larger parcels of land and doesn't usually yield as much profit per unit of space, so they can't afford to pay top dollar to put a factory in the middle of the city. But they also value being close to suppliers and to clients, and so they also have a negatively sloping demand curve that falls off as you move away from the city center. The key point for the economists is that this demand curve doesn't fall as steeply as for the service businesses, so at some point the two curves actually cross. This point, marked in the diagram by a dotted vertical line, turns out to be where the central business district gives way to the manufacturing area that Burgess called the zone in transition. Similarly, people looking for a place to live are assumed to have an even flatter demand curve for space based on distance from the center. An apartment building can't compete with an office skyscraper in terms of generating profits, so residential use can't bid up the price of property to the astronomical levels found in the city center. The demand curve for residential land use starts out lower than either of the other two, but again falls off slower than either of them. So eventually this third curve crosses over the demand curve of manufacturing land use. This intersection and its vertical dotted line mark the point where land use in the city shifts over from manufacturing to residential suburbs. Finally, agriculture is the most space-intensive land use possible, requiring huge areas for production. In this diagram, farmers are assumed to be completely insensitive to location in the central city or someplace else. They don't want to pay a lot for land to grow their crops or raise their cattle. But eventually, moving further out of the city, you come to the final crossover point where people are no longer willing to pay more for the land in order to build a house on it than the farmers are willing to pay to use it for farming. This intersection point is where the suburbs stop and the countryside begins. These economic assumptions about how much different groups are willing to pay for land, depending on how close it is to the urban core, gives us an elegant explanation for the concentric zones seen in Burgess's urban ecology model of the city. But what does it have to do with sprawl? Sprawl basically means expanding the circles in the first diagram. The only way to move these circles is to shift the demand curves describing how much people are willing to pay for the use of land. In particular, if you can make it easier and cheaper for people to get back and forth between different places in the city, you devalue the importance of having to locate in the center. This should mean that more people will be willing to pay more money to locate further out into the suburban rings and flatten out the residential demand curve as shown here in the second diagram. At the same time, with economic growth and higher income and employment levels, people have more money to spend on their homes. So the rising standard of living should shift the whole residential demand curve upward, also as shown here. The combination of these effects shifts the third and final intersection point between residential and agricultural land use further out into the countryside as more farms are converted into subdivisions. Patacchini assumes that this fundamental economic process will work in the same way no matter where you look in the world, including Europe as well as the United States. Cheaper commuting, which she measures by access to cars, should mean more sprawl. Higher incomes and employment should also mean more sprawl. But there's another factor in the sprawl equation that has nothing to do with these demand curves for efficient allocation of land. Many of the articles considered in previous weeks emphasize the role of ethnic sorting as one of the strongest motives for urban deconcentration and segregation. Even though it requires some mental gymnastics to reinterpret this segregation impulse in economic language, Patacchini and her colleagues also include this factor in their theoretical design. Cities with a larger share of minority residents should generate a stronger impulse toward ethnic segregation, and this impulse also might be related to the degree of urban sprawl. These European scholars, however, run into a serious problem in terms of just how ethnic segregation might affect deconcentration of cities. From an American perspective, this seems pretty clear-cut. More minority residents in a city should intensify what has been called white flight to the suburbs. So you would expect cities with larger shares of minorities also to exhibit more sprawl stretching out into the surrounding countryside. Patacchini makes the opposite assumption about European cities, that higher proportions of minorities in cities should actually slow down the movement to suburbs and result in less urban sprawl. This unusual conclusion may seem strange to an American, but it makes perfect sense to a European. If you read the article carefully before answering the first questions and viewing the first part of this lecture, the assumption by the authors that more ethnic minorities would translate into less urban sprawl in Europe rather than more probably didn't generate much mystery or suspense for you. Even though it is a strange idea at first for American observers, there is a perfectly good reason why larger minority populations would slow down the movement to the suburban fringe in Paris or Rome or Berlin. Slower suburbanization is certainly not due to any greater tolerance for living together in mixed ethnic neighborhoods. The tribal mentality of identifying with your own ethnic group and feeling uncomfortable or even hostile towards other ethnicities continues to run at least as strong in European hearts as it does anywhere else in the world. No society has a monopoly on ignorance, fear, negative stereotypes, scapegoating, and other familiar ingredients of discrimination and segregation as ways of life. The difference in European cities is simply where these minority populations tend to concentrate. From listening to the Chicago School, we learned to assume that ethnic minorities settle in the zone in transition near the center of cities. But in comparative perspective, we can now recognize that this familiar pattern was shaped by special historical, economic, and political factors in the United States. Chicago School observed urban life in the early 20th century, when most immigrants were needed as workers in urban factories. The property market in U.S. cities was in the hands of private developers, thinking only in terms of making the most possible profit from each parcel of property. In European cities 100 years later, things are very different. New minority immigrants are not settling in the center of the city. Instead, they're concentrating in a ring of segregated low-income neighborhoods around the outskirts of the urban area. For example, when immigrants from North Africa and other parts of the developing world erupted in riots in Paris some years ago, and we could watch video of burning cars in the streets and angry mobs, these riots were not concentrated in the city center, as they had been in Detroit or Philadelphia or Watts in Los Angeles 3 decades earlier. This map shows that the riots concentrated on the northeastern fringe of the Paris metropolitan region, in several suburbs whose names appear next to the sites of the worst violence. This leads us to our second question in this little detective story. Why are the minority populations concentrated around the edges of so many European cities instead of being concentrated in blighted central cities as we're so used to seeing in the United States? And once again, the answer proves to be relatively simple. In the second half of the 20th century, planners and government officials in many European countries fell under the spell of architectural pioneers like Le Corbusier in France and the Bauhaus school in Germany. Great enthusiasm developed for the idea that many of the ills of growing and maturing industrial cities were due to small, outdated, overcrowded, and unsanitary housing. If only the old run-down little shacks could all be removed and new, modern blocks of streamlined apartment buildings could take their place, surrounded by green open spaces and equipped with modern plumbing and electricity, the common people of the city would be a lot better off, and many social problems might just fade away. You can recognize buildings from this period all over the world, since the missionary crusades of these new architectural prophets reached out across international boundaries. In the United States, where migrants had already concentrated in central cities, this urban renewal activity took place in those central cities. So that is where these huge housing projects appeared. In Europe, the massive wave of immigration only began late in the 20th century, rather than late in the 19th century as in the USA. So these immigrants never concentrated in the European central cities to begin with. Instead, the massive housing projects and massive high-rise apartment buildings were built on the outskirts of these cities, for example in Paris in the areas that are known as banlieues. The second map shown here shows the retreat of blue-collar workers to the outskirts of the city. These urban fringes became the poorer neighborhoods of the city. And so naturally, when immigrants began to crowd into these cities, they gravitated outward to the big housing projects in these poorer neighborhoods. So, of course, this raises yet a third question. Why were the European housing projects built out on the edge of the city, rather than in the central core as in the United States. In the U.S. case, urban growth and deconcentration has been driven by private entrepreneurs who made big profits by noticing the shifting demand curve for residential land use that came along with the automobile age, and then buying up and developing the land that was shifting from farmland into the expanding residential zone. Naturally, they wanted as much profit as possible from this development process, so they built the biggest, most expensive houses that the market would bear. The government helped them along by paying 90% of the cost of new freeways to get people back and forth to these new suburbs, and by providing government-regulated mortgage insurance to allow more people to afford mortgages and buy all the new houses. The picture is very different. For one thing, in most European countries, the city governments themselves can get involved in the real estate market. A city can deliberately intervene between the farmers and the developers and preemptively buy up farmland critically positioned on the edge of the city. This land can then be sold to private developers, but at a considerably higher price, so that the city shares in the profit of developing the land. The city can also attach conditions about what kinds of buildings can be placed on the newly developed land, and can even decide to locate publicly financed housing projects out there at the edge of the city instead of more dispersed single-family residences, which is what they did in many cases. And if a private developer or two manages to buy up some farmland and convert it to residential use, European cities also can levy a special development tax on the profit from the conversion, so that again the city will capture part of the profit of development. This very different legal and political role for city governments in European countries meant that a lot of the private enterprise free-for-all that produced the sprawling U.S. suburbs was simply not allowed to happen in most of Europe. Instead, the suburbs ended up being the poorer areas around these cities. So more minorities do not mean more sprawl in Europe. To escape from minorities, Americans run off to the suburbs and produce sprawl. In Europe, to escape from minorities, people instead avoid the suburbs and concentrate their residential investments more intensively inside the existing city. This process, often called gentrification, is visible on both sides of the Atlantic, but it is much more prominent in European cities. For example, if we consider this map of Paris showing the areas with the fastest increases in property values, or très forte valorisation, we see at once that the central areas of the city have been experiencing very strong increases in value, while the areas of falling property values are all spread around the outskirts of the city. So it does make good sense for Patacchini and her colleagues to include a hypothesis in their model that cities with higher proportions of minority residents will experience less urban sprawl, not more as we might expect in the United States. They lined up all their data from cities all over Europe and tried to predict which cities were more or less densely settled. Patacchini and her colleagues found fairly solid support for their first hypothesis, that cities with more access to cars would also be more spread out and have lower population density. Of course, this is a sort of chicken and egg situation because we can't be sure whether more cars produce deconcentration or the deconcentration calls for more cars. But at least they do go together enough to produce a statistically very significant negative coefficient in the first row of their findings, presented in their Table 7. Remember when you look at this table that what they're predicting is higher population density, so a negative coefficient means less dense, more spread out, deconcentrated cities. And empirical support for their special European hypothesis that more foreigners from outside the European Union, in other words, different ethnic minorities, will lead to higher density of settlement rather than deconcentration. This is a fairly weak second-rate sort of effect in their model, but the positive sign is in the right direction to fit with their theoretical expectations about Europe's special immigrant suburbs and their effect on urban sprawl. The positive link of more immigrants to higher city density is also robust enough to be statistically significant. Just as more cars were linked to more deconcentrated cities, they also find that higher employment rates and higher income predict more urban deconcentration in Europe. Their measurement of income is not actually based on individuals' reports of personal income, though. They have figures for each city as a whole, measuring the total economic output, and they divide this by the population total to get a per capita figure. This total output can include other income besides the personal incomes of individuals, such as incomes of businesses in the city and so on. But this result, like the result for cars, is the same as we would expect to find in American cities. Only the link between more foreigners and less sprawl is different from the situation in the United States. Finally, they know that bigger cities will have higher population density regardless of any of the other things that they've considered. So they also include a final measure of total population size of the city in the last row of their table of results. As everyone would expect, this measure is extremely powerful, extremely statistically significant, and positive. The bigger the city, the more densely the population is packed into it. Even though everybody knew they would find this result, it is important to include it in the model so that you don't get some of this population size effect mixed into the measurement of some of your other expected patterns. Confirmed most of their basic hypotheses about what makes some European cities more crowded and others more spread out, they decided to look into some more detailed comparisons across cities. Rather than make up various categories of cities based on their own preconceived ideas, they applied a statistical technique called principal component analysis. This is a complicated calculation with a simple goal. Looking at the long list of things they measured for each city, shown in their Table 8, we can guess that many of these different measurements are probably correlated with one another. That is, if we know a city's score on one of them, that information helps us to predict the same city's score on some other measure. For example, we already know that cities with more people also tend to have higher population densities. Also guess that cities with more highly educated people probably will have less people working in industrial jobs. They have so much information here that they would really like to be able to boil down their results to a few more manageable conclusions. Principal components are synthetic, imaginary combinations of many different actual measurements, sort of like an index. The virtue of each such component identify is that it is totally uncorrelated with any other component they may find. It can be difficult to figure out what to call such components since they're completely artificial combinations of other measures, but you can get a reasonable idea of what each component is about by looking at how the scores for specific measures average out for that component. Their PC1 component includes a strong positive average score for population size, and also for population density. We can simply go down the column in this Table 8 and look for all the places where the score for this component has a large value that has an opposite sign from the value for the next component, or a large value for some measure that makes only a tiny difference for the next component. From this inspection of the ingredients of component 1, we get the idea that cities with high positive scores on this factor tend to be large, dense cities with higher crime rates but lower unemployment. They tend to have more corporate headquarters and more industrial manufacturing jobs, as well as more commercial jobs, more universities, and more developed public transportation. The weather and climate variables even enable the authors to guess that we're mainly talking about such larger, older cities in northwestern Europe for component 1. An analysis like this can have any number of components, but usually we find that only the first couple of components manage to explain almost all of the variation among cities. In this case, the first two components they identified captured fully 79% of all the variations observed among all their cities, so they decide to quit with these two. Looking down the column for the second factor, we can see that high scores on this factor tend to point to smaller cities that are less densely settled, usually in southeastern Europe, with less crime but more unemployment, fewer corporate home offices, less industry and higher education, but more reliance on cars. When they have their results from this principal components analysis, Patacchini and her colleagues can turn around and use the values of these two components for each new city as variables to study. They present a scatter plot of all the cities they examined, with each city's score on the first component plotted somewhere along the horizontal axis from negative values on the left to positive values on the right. Each city's score on the second component is plotted somewhere along the vertical axis, from negative values at the bottom to positive values at the top. They point out what they call Group A in the lower right of the plot, with high component 1 scores, but negative component 2 scores. These are mostly larger, older cities in northwestern Europe. They also point out Group B in the upper left part of the plot, mostly smaller cities in Greece and other Mediterranean countries. In general, most countries in Europe fall along the diagonal between these two groups. Of course, this is no accident. It is an automatic byproduct of the method itself, since the two components have to be uncorrelated with each other. There are also a few countries with high positive values on both components, or even high negative values on both components. Two commentators who add some discussion of the article at the end of this reading are mostly concerned about some technical details in the article, such as whether the measurements for the largest European cities might have left out a lot of their suburbs due to the special administrative focus of the boundaries used. They also concentrate a lot of their attention on how reliable the confirmations of general economic theory might be, such as the findings that more cars, more jobs, and higher income tend to go along with more spread out cities. But none of these concerns of the commentators really affect the most important conclusion for our comparative study of cities: the finding that in Europe, the cities with the highest shares of ethnic minorities also tend to be more densely settled, instead of being more spread out and deconcentrated. This contrast with patterns in the United States is bound to make us think a little harder about the political context of urban life. The different rules and roles for city governments in different countries can apparently have profound effects on the physical patterns of that urban life, including even opposite effects of minority segregation for issues like urban sprawl.